In the previous video we investigated the idea that we could recognize a terrorist by way of profiling. In this video we will explore and analyze the assumption that terrorists can be de-radicalized. In other words, we look into the idea that individuals change their attitudes and behavior and leave terrorism behind. Is that indeed possible or just wishful thinking? What can we learn from past experience, and what have scholars and experts to say about this? Before we will address these questions, we first have to define the term. What is de-radicalization? What is meant by this term? Well, de-radicalization, like most concepts, can have different meanings to different people. And I will use the definition by John Horgan, who did a lot of research into this field, into radicalization and de-radicalization. And he regards it as a social and psychological process whereby an individual's commitment to and involvement in violent radicalization is reduced to the extent that they are no longer at risk of involvement and engagement in violent activity. But de-radicalization can also be understood as a policy or program. So not only a process, an individual process or group process, but also as a government or civil society program. And that program seeks to reverse the radicalization process for those already or partly radicalized, or help them to disengage from radical or extreme groups they are involved in or of which they are members. And it's important to say that de-radicalization is not radicalization in reverse. These are two very distinct processes. Who has said that it is possible to de-radicalize a terrorist? According to Angel Rabasa and his colleagues at Rand, Washington, this is a simple fact that can be observed. And in a report in 2013, they stated, just as there are processes through which an individual becomes an extremist, there are also processes through which an extremist comes to renounce violence, leaves a group or movement, or even rejects a radical worldview. Well, the last part is contested. Do people really give up their radical worldviews? Is that possible? And is it possible to actively de-radicalize persons? And if so, how? Well, these are, of course, very important questions for those who fight terrorism, who deal with terrorism. The first proof that it is possible are individuals who left terrorism behind and who are now involved in counter-radicalization and de-radicalization projects. They turn from terrorists into experts that try to help people to prevent them from joining terrorist organizations. And within the field of terrorism studies, there are a number of them that are quite well known. Here you have three examples of them. David Gartenstein-Ross, who worked for a Wahhabi charity that proved to be an Al-Qaeda financier, and who is now director of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which is based in Washington, and he's a scholar in the field of terrorism and counterterrorism studies. I'm also proud to say that he's a former guest researcher at the ICCT The Hague, just a few offices away from this office. And then Noman bin Adnan, who was a leading figure of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, active in Afghanistan, and who is now a senior analyst at the British Killian Foundation. And he, for instance, wrote an open letter to bin Laden in 2010, recommending him to hold your violence and reconsider your aims and strategy. And then an example from Northern Ireland, Henry Robinson, who joined the official Irish Republican Army in 1979 and who left it, and in 1990 was the co-founder of the foundation Families Against Intimidation and Terror. Besides these individuals who left terrorism behind, also known as formers or former terrorists, there are de-radicalization programs. Well, in general, these de-radicalization programs are of two types. The first category focuses on individual ideological de-radicalization using psychological or religious counseling to produce a change of mind, a change of attitude, and in the end also a change of behavior. And the second category aims for collective de-radicalization, using, for instance, political negotiations to obtain a type of change of behavior, and it includes measures such as ceasefires or the decommissioning of arms. In Europe, there are many examples of de-radicalization programs that are aimed at right-wing extremists, especially in the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, as well as in Germany and the Netherlands. Well, for instance, in Norway, an exit model was developed based on research conducted by Tore Bjørgaard, and this model was also used in Sweden, where it consists of 5 phases, from motivation and disengagement to making sure that these people are part of society, again, like settlement, reflection and stabilization. And on the other side of the globe in Indonesia, there are quite a number of de-radicalization programs that mainly are aimed at prisoners. And some of them, and prisoners that were involved in jihadi terrorism. And some of them are now closely cooperating with the police. And in Saudi Arabia, such programs, also aimed mainly at prisoners, focus on rehabilitation through religious re-education and psychological counseling. And then in Colombia, they try to disengage not only prisoners but also active members of the FARC, and the Colombian judiciary tries to facilitate this by suspending the militants' trial in an attempt to encourage and sustain their demobilization. There the key word is demobilization and not de-radicalization. But the same idea the basic idea is to make sure that they leave terrorism behind and perhaps also change their attitudes and behavior. Well, in other words, many examples from around the world, each with a different size and scope, methods and goals. What do experts and academics have to say about de-radicalization and de-radicalization programs? Well, about 5 years ago, quite a few of them pointed at a lack of attention, expertise and research into this field. But in recent years there has been an increase in the amount of studies and the amount of programs that has helped us to gain more insight into the challenges and possibilities of de-radicalization in general and that of programs in particular. It also raised new questions, and an important one is whether or not one can speak of de-radicalization, as defined by John Horgan, when a person leaves a terrorist group behind but not his or her radical ideas. Is that de-radicalization, or should we just call that differently? For instance, label it disengagement and nothing more. Well, the prevailing opinion today is that leaving terrorism behind does not necessarily mean that the person is also de-radicalized. He or she can still have very radical ideas, and they often have. And many de-radicalization programs are in fact primarily aiming for this idea of leaving terrorism behind. They're aiming for disengagement and not so much de-radicalization. And I guess that is more cost effective, and also from a point of view from society, it should be given more priority, as changed behavior matters more than changed ideas. What about the success of these programs? Do they work? And are they proof of the assumption that it is possible to de-radicalize a terrorist? John Horgan is skeptical about certain types of programs, especially the ones that aim for demobilization, defection, de-escalation and rehabilitation. And in his eyes, this is not the same as de-radicalization. Demobilization is not the same as de-radicalization. Well, I guess he's right. And he seems to suggest that many of the persons that go through these programs might still pose a risk of involvement and engagement in violent activity in the future. And there are indeed quite a few examples of graduates of these programs that returned to violence, that returned to terrorism after they were released, especially in the case of Saudi Arabia. Well, it should be noted that the programs in this particular country were enormous. They processed more than 4,000 detainees. But there have been a number of people who, after that, ended up in the ranks of terrorist organizations. So, successful or not, well, here's an example or a study that indicates that there has been some success. A survey of de-radicalization programs conducted by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, based on 13 brief case studies from around the world, showed that under certain conditions, programs can be effective. And they also listed a number of very interesting recommendations and important lessons from these cases. And one of them is that programs are effective, and this is very important, when they are voluntary, and that personal commitment is vital. It makes sense, but also the studies show that that is a very important element. For a copy of this very interesting report, well, see the list of recommended readings. All in all, it's clear that de-radicalization is indeed possible. Many people leave terrorism behind, some thanks to de-radicalization programs, and some also leave behind their radical ideas. In sum, we defined the term and noticed a difference between de-radicalization and disengagement. We've seen an increase in both the number of programs and the number of studies into this field. Most of the de-radicalization programs primarily aim at disengagement rather than de-radicalization. And there are successes of individual and group de-radicalization. Therefore, we regard the assumption that de-radicalization is possible to be true. In the next video, we will investigate the idea that decapitation of terrorist organizations and terrorist groups work.